Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We are going to find out very quickly whether Canadian car and truck buyers are really all that interested in electric vehicles if they have to pay the full sticker price. Transport Canada announced this week that the federal fund that gave EV purchasers a $5,000 rebate is basically run dry. Cash rebates now only exist provincially in Quebec and BC. I'm Mike Eppel. Today on The Big Story, we're speaking to the head of Global Automakers of Canada, which represents a whole host of foreign car brands, including the likes of Toyota, BMW, VW, and Mercedes, along with many others, and about how this could dramatically hamper sales of hybrids and fully electric vehicles, and why the automakers and car dealers are all now calling on Ottawa to scrap the mandates for when the industry has to officially stop selling new gas-powered cars and trucks. And we'll also talk about the risks to Canada's auto industry in general if the Trump administration follows through on the plan for 25% tariffs. David Adams is the president and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
The plan or announcement by Transport Canada that the rebates had basically run out of any money, and they were supposed to go till March. I'm assuming that had to do with some sort of budgetary measure, that at that point they would have been re-upped. But the fact that they're bone dry at this point, did this come as a shock to the manufacturers and the auto industry?
Let's be fair. I mean, not a complete shock. We've had ongoing dialogue with Transport Canada and other federal officials around this program. Part of our perspective on the whole transition to electrification, the fact that the federal government has a federal zero-emission vehicle mandate in place, this is a component of it. So we've had ongoing dialogue, but I think the reality is part of our dialogue has been, okay, we know the program is scheduled to expire in March. What are your plans for after March? We need to avoid a situation where people don't know what's happening and the fund runs dry without any notification. And yet here we are with exactly that scenario playing out. The challenge for dealers primarily and consumers is, we're advised on Friday that there was 70 million left, in the kitty, so to speak, and that the program would expire before the March deadline. But found out on Monday through another email communique that all of a sudden that $70 million had somehow disappeared over the weekend, even though the Transport Canada officials have previously said that the burn rate on the fund was about $100 million a month. So we should have had at least a few more weeks left in the kitty before being told that the program was ending.
I don't recall any mention of this in the fall fiscal update. Would that not have been the place to have some money allocated to extend it or what have you?
One would have thought that would have been the case, and that's just another example of the lack of forethought around the continuation of this program, especially given the political realities of potentially heading into an early election, and that's certainly where we find ourselves right now, where the federal officials can say the program is just paused, but the reality is Parliament's prorogued until March 24th. We're likely going to be into an election, which is likely to be sometime in May by the time we get a new government elected. Given the situation come Monday with potential tariffs, I mean, I can't see a reality where these incentives would ever be put back in place as much as they're truly needed, I think, for consumers to have the gap bridged between, buying a traditional vehicle vis-a-vis paying the cost premium to buy an electric vehicle.
Well, I was just going to ask, is this going to tell exactly how important, how much of a carrot is necessary to get buyers to look at EVs as opposed to a gas-powered car or truck?
You got it. No, absolutely. And I think, what we see in jurisdictions, not only in Canada, but around the world, when incentives are in place, yes, they encourage consumers to adopt the technology. When those incentives are removed, and we saw that most recently in Canada and in Ontario, and a little bit in Quebec, and we can talk about that as well. But when the the new government came into power in Ontario in 2018, the very lucrative $14,000 incentive was dropped, and guess what? EV sales dropped like a stone as well, and Quebec has telegraphed that they're ending their program, and that's part of, I think, what has contributed to this rush federally because Quebecers were trying to get. We're out of money as well and has paused their program. So if you're in Quebec, the consumers are in a situation now where, expected incentive of potentially $12,000, or I guess with a new incentive, $8,000 is now zero. So we can anticipate that EV sales are going to drop like a stone in Quebec as well, and really across Canada. And that's unfortunate when, especially for consumers, but for manufacturers, from 2026, we're going to be moving into the zero emission vehicle mandate, where manufacturers are required to sell a certain percentage of EVs, 20% in 2026, or pay penalties for not doing so.
Well, how long? We've got auto shows coming up here, and I can bet dollars to donuts that is going to be 80-90% of the vehicles being shown EVs or hybrids. This is obviously a massive headache for the industry. No.
Oh, it is, and I think one thing to be clear. The industry, the future of the industry is electrified, and there's no question about that. And I think what we've seen over the last, in particular, I would say the last 6 months or so, is there's been, some lumpiness and the realities coming to ground that, look, consumer adoption is not happening at the rate that everybody expected, which has ramifications for, for manufacturers and whatnot as well. So, it sounds a little ironic given the issue with the incentive program, where you would assume that sales, EVs were flying off the shelves. But yeah, there is growth, but it's just not the growth that had been expected. So it is, this whole transition is going to continue to be, as to say, lumpy and problematic as everybody figures out, well, what is really the natural rate of adoption as we transition to zero emission vehicles. And for that to happen, our industry has always said, look, we need really two key things. And survey after survey of Canadians reflects that the price needs to come down, and the charging infrastructure needs to be ubiquitous, and it has to work. And those two things, federal government has now removed the incentives, and they've been they actually slowed the rate of introduction of charging infrastructure in 2024 vis-a-vis 2023. So they're not likely to meet their own charging infrastructure deployment targets. So it's a real challenge for the industry and for consumers that actually would like to adopt the technology.
Well, let's talk about the mandate specifically, because if the government has all these targets that the auto industry has to meet, yet no, they're not providing the buyer incentives or, as you say, the charging infrastructure. How realistic then are those mandates, and do they need to be changed? And overriding all of that, the idea that telling consumers you have to do something as opposed to giving them choice doesn't necessarily play well from the buyer the buyer incentive base.
Sure, and that's sort of exactly where we've landed as an industry with this. Is that, look, if you're going to remove the fundamental pieces of the puzzle that were designed to support your mandate, then you really do need to reconsider the mandate, because the other reality is that automakers will have choices to make as well in terms of how they respond if they that consumers are not buying the vehicles that they're putting into the market. And that's not likely to be, reductions in the cost of these vehicles, because most manufacturers aren't making any money on EVs that they're deploying into the marketplace at the moment. So other solutions will need to be sorted out. So it is highly problematic, and we are calling on the federal government to reconsider its mandate. And not only the federal government, but, like, as you're probably aware, Mike, both the provinces of Quebec and BC have zero emission vehicle mandates as well, and their targets are frankly even more outlandish than what the federal government says of mandate targets are. With BC looking to have 90% zero emission vehicles, that's their target for 2030, not 2035, and Quebec likewise has an 85% target for 2030. So these targets seem highly unrealistic given the environment that we're in currently.
How many years would we be away in your best guesstimate to where an EV, from a manufacturing standpoint, costs the same to produce as opposed to a traditional vehicle?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I would point to is the government's own analysis of the what I think they called the mandate the electric vehicle availability standard, but in their own regulatory impact assessment analysis, they suggested that even by 2035, with the exception of one small sector or segment of vehicles rather, even by 2035, there would not be cost parity. So we're a long way out from cost parity. Hopefully that will come sooner rather than later. But part of that is contingent on battery prices continuing to fall, which they are doing. And the other, I guess, key component of that, which most people don't necessarily appreciate, is it's also just the reality of getting scale of production of EVs. If you're building an EV assembly facility for 150 or 200,000 vehicles, and you're only building 30,000 vehicles or 20,000 vehicles in that facility, then the cost per vehicle amortized is much higher. So those two things really need to happen in tandem before we're going to see cost parity. But hopefully that comes sooner rather than later. And I think if you look around the world at jurisdictions that have been successful in most of their vehicles being purchased being EVs, and Norway is always cited as an example. But I think if you look at Norway, they had a significant value-added tax on all vehicles sold, and the proposition to induce consumers to buy EVs was to remove the value-added tax on EVs, which immediately made those vehicles cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles. So when a product is cheaper, obviously consumers are going to migrate to that cheaper product, I think.
Now, whether it's EVs or a traditional car or truck with a gas-powered motor, the next big worry, I'm assuming, is this threat by the incoming U.S. president about tariffs.
Sure.
Can you even prepare for that at this point? And if so, what's the discussion?
Yeah, I've been looking at this, and in my own mind, I'm comparing it a little bit to COVID. We knew something big was coming, but we didn't know how big it was going to be and how hard it was going to hit us. And I think that's really the situation with Monday as our industry and really the whole Canadian economy. Politicians across the country look at what we can expect and how we're going to deal with it. I think one of the things we do know from the previous Trump administration is that President-elect tends to do what he says he's going to do. So we need to take that tariff threat seriously. Now, will those tariffs be at the level of 25%? Will they be targeted at different areas of the economy vis-a-vis others? Who knows? But I think governments and, frankly, Canadian business broadly are doing different scenario analysis, contingency planning to try and prepare for something that right now remains a bit of an unknown. But economists that have commented on this, as you're probably well aware of, have reflected that could be quite devastating for the Canadian economy in terms of dollar hitting 150, 155, taking a 2 to 3 percentage point hit on GDP. Those types of things not helpful at all for Canada and Canadians that are already challenged economically.
Well, and of all of the industries that are integrated from a cross-border standpoint, the automotive sector is top of the list. When you think about the shipping of you hear about a vehicle going from point A in the United States here to Canada, back to the States, and the parts, and same thing Mexico to the U.S. and what have you. I don't even know how the tax jurisdiction works when you're crossing the border that many times. Is it at the final production where the levies and or taxes are placed on a vehicle, or is it on each move through the border? Just figuring out how that's all going to transpire, and we don't know the details. So that's that's got to be a tremendously worrying aspect of all of this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you look at the automotive industry, you've been the poster child, as you say, for kind of free trade, effective trade since the mid 1960s, when the Auto Pact was signed as the first sort of sectoral trade agreement between the two countries. And I think if we look at this, and this is part of the message that we've been trying to relay, is that look. In our sector in particular, we're not building things for each other. We're actually building things with each other, on the premise that you just highlighted, that, look, we've got some components that are starting in Ontario maybe. They're going to the U.S. for further work. They're being shipped back into Ontario, maybe being put in a vehicle in Ontario or further work being done there before being shipped back to the U.S. We put in a vehicle there. And the other reality is that in every Canadian vehicle that's produced, there's upwards of 50% American content in those vehicles. So again, if the U.S. is going to tariff Canadian vehicles, then effectively they're tariffing themselves to a certain extent.
Do you think that, though, is going to be the big pressure point? Last time I checked, Michigan was a pretty big auto-producing state. Kentucky. All these states that have massive auto industry connections or ties, those states are and leadership, they're not going to be happy with this idea. So is that where the internal pressure maybe to avoid this is going to come from?
Well, look, I think the governments broadly, our federal government, even being a little bit rudderless at the moment, but in particular, government of Ontario, other provincial governments, they've all been putting a bit of a charm offensive and full court press on not only officials in Washington, departments in Washington, but also in key states, as you mentioned, Mike, where there's a high degree of trade reliance on Ontario in particular, or conversely, where Ontario is the biggest trading partner for those particular states. So again, trying to build the I guess critical mass of folks that are willing to and can and do have the ear of the president-elect and those individuals around him to say, this is not a great idea, because it's ultimately going to come back and hurt American business in a way that's certainly challenging. So one would hope that those voices are being heard, and that cooler heads will prevail with respect to this tariff issue. But I guess we'll find out on Monday.
I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us.
And thanks for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
That's David Adams, the president and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. You've been listening to The Big Story. You can follow us on X at The Big Story FPN. Leave your comments. You can also listen to The Big Story and all of the other Frequency Network podcasts on the Seeker app. That's SEEKR. Thanks for listening.